Hey guys, tonight we climb down into one of the most exhausting jobs in the ancient world. The miserable life of a rower on an ancient warship. The air smells like salt, wet wood, and something far less pleasant that has been baking under the Mediterranean sun all morning. You're standing on a crowded dock staring at a long, narrow ship that looks sleek from a distance, but deeply suspicious up close. The hull stretches out like a wooden spear resting on the water. Dozens of oars stick from its sides like stiff legs of some giant insect, and unfortunately, those oars are about to become your full-time problem. You might imagine ancient naval service as heroic. Shining helmets, proud captains, epic sea battles, the sort of thing that would look great painted on a pottery vase. But your role in this grand historical painting is much less glamorous. You're not the captain. You're not even one of the soldiers standing proudly on deck. No. Your job is to sit on a narrow wooden bench and pull an oar for hours until your shoulders feel like they're made of molten lead. And if you're thinking, how bad could rowing really be? Well, let's just say historians agree that most modern gym workouts look like a relaxing spa day compared to this. Someone behind you shouts, and the line of men begins shuffling forward toward the gangplank. The ship waits patiently, rocking gently in the water. Up close, it feels less like a vessel and more like a floating machine built entirely for one purpose: speed. This type of ship is known as a trireme, the most famous warship of the ancient Mediterranean world. If you lived in the naval powers of the time, particularly in places like ancient Greece, these ships were the backbone of military strength. A typical trireme carries around 170 rowers. Yes, 170. Which means that if you've ever complained about a crowded bus commute, ancient naval architects would politely laugh. You step onto the deck and immediately realise something important. The ship isn't crowded up here. In fact, there's plenty of room for the officers, the helmsman and the marines who will eventually fight on deck. But that's not where you're going. A sailor points you toward a narrow opening leading down into the hull. You duck under a beam and climb into the lower level, and suddenly the pleasant sea breeze disappears. Down here the air is thick, warm, and smells like damp wood mixed with sweat that has been collecting for weeks. Long wooden benches run the length of the ship, stacked in tight rows. Each bench has a single oar beside it, sliding through a small opening in the hull. This is your station. You squeeze into place, shoulder to shoulder with men who look just as uncertain as you do. Your knees nearly touch the back of the man in front of you. The oar beside you is massive, longer than you expected, its wooden handle smooth from years of desperate pulling. A grizzled sailor walks down the aisle, inspecting the newcomers like a farmer evaluating livestock. "First time?" he mutters. You nod. He chuckles in a way that suggests you're about to regret many life choices. Now, here's a fascinating historical detail. Despite the miserable conditions, many rowers on ships like this were not slaves at all. In powerful naval states, especially democratic Athens, rowers were often free citizens, which sounds noble, until you realise citizenship apparently came with complementary shoulder injuries. Historians still argue whether this system gave lower-class citizens unusual political influence, since the navy depended so heavily on them. If your warships need thousands of rowers, suddenly the poor guy with strong arms becomes strategically important. Unfortunately, strategic importance does not make rowing any more comfortable. The overseer climbs aboard and bangs a wooden staff against the beam. "Sit straight! Feet braced!" Everyone scrambles to adjust. You place your feet against a wooden bar designed to give leverage when pulling the oar. The bench beneath you is narrow and unforgiving, clearly designed by someone who has never sat on it for 8 hours. The drummer sits near the front of the ship. That's when you realise something unsettling. Rowing on these ships isn't random, it's synchronized. Every movement must match perfectly or the oars collide and the ship slows. The drummer raises his sticks. Boom! The first beat echoes through the hull. You pull the oar. Boom! You pull again. At first it seems manageable. A steady rhythm, almost hypnotic. The ship begins to glide across the harbour, but within minutes your shoulders start complaining. The oar is heavier than it looks. The motion uses muscles you rarely think about, and the beat of the drum never slows. Boom! Pull! Boom! Pull! The ship picks up speed, slicing through the water with impressive efficiency. From above it must look elegant, a sleek predator gliding across the sea. Down here, it feels like group punishment. Sweat begins forming almost immediately. The air grows hotter as dozens of men pull in unison. The smell becomes memorable. A veteran rower beside you mutters, "Pace yourself." You glance over. "How long do we row?" He grins in a way that suggests you really shouldn't have asked, until they tell us to stop, which according to ancient records could mean several hours at a time during long voyages. Here's another curious historical tidbit. Ancient warships like triremes were actually pulled onto beaches at night rather than left anchored offshore. Their lightweight design made them fast, but also fragile. Leaving them floating unattended risked damage. So every evening after a full day of rowing, you might also be dragging the entire ship onto land. Fun. Historians still argue whether rowers remained seated at their benches during battle preparations, or were allowed short breaks before combat. Either way, when war approached, the rhythm of the drum became faster. Much faster. But that's a problem for later. For now, the harbour slowly shrinks behind you. The coastline becomes a thin strip of land. Open water stretches ahead in every direction. The drumbeat continues. Your shoulders ache. The man in front of you smells like a goat that has been marinating in seawater, and the day has barely begun. Somewhere above deck, officers discuss tactics, navigation, and the glory of naval warfare. Down here, the reality is simpler. Pull, breathe, pull again. And try not to think about how long this journey might last, because if this is your first day as a rower on an ancient warship, you're probably not going to enjoy the rest of the week. Morning light filters weakly through the narrow slits above the oar ports, but it does very little to improve the atmosphere below deck. You're beginning to understand something important about life on an ancient warship. Sunlight is mostly a rumour. The drumbeat has slowed now, and the ship glides steadily across calm water. Your shoulders burn with that deep, dull ache that arrives when muscles realise they've been tricked into far more work than they signed up for. Around you, the other rowers breathe heavily in rhythm, the air thick with the sound of effort. You shift slightly on the bench, which turns out to be a mistake. The wood has no padding, no mercy, and absolutely no concern for your long-term comfort. In fact, whoever designed these benches probably believed comfort was suspicious. A veteran beside you notices your awkward movement. "Don't wiggle too much," he mutters quietly. "Why?" "You'll regret it later." You decide not to ask further questions. Experience is already teaching you that the less curiosity you show down here, the fewer unpleasant surprises you discover. The Trireme itself is a strange machine. From the outside it looks elegant and efficient, but inside it feels more like a carefully organised human engine. Every man here is simply one part of a giant rowing mechanism. Ancient shipbuilders, particularly those working in the naval cities of Athens, designed these ships with incredible precision. The Trireme usually measured about 35 metres long, roughly the length of a modern basketball court, yet it remained surprisingly light. That lightness allowed the ship to move quickly across the water, but it also meant there was absolutely no extra space inside. 3 tiers of rowers sit stacked above one another. You happen to be on the middle level, known historically as the Zygitae. Above you sit the Thranitai, and below you are the Thalamitai, the unlucky rowers closest to the waterline. Those lower rowers sometimes get splashed constantly when waves slap the hull, so at least you have that small victory. The ship creaks gently as it moves. Wood flexes with each stroke of the oars. Occasionally you hear footsteps above deck, where officers walk around with fresh air and sunlight. 2 luxuries that feel almost mythical from where you sit. The overseer strolls through the aisle again. He isn't carrying a whip today, which is comforting, but he does carry a long stick that he uses to tap the rhythm on the beams. "Keep the stroke clean," he says lazily. The drum begins again. Boom, you pull. Boom, you pull again. Over time, the rhythm becomes strangely hypnotic. Your body begins adapting to the pattern. Lean forward, pull back, breathe out. The oar slices through the water with a steady splash. It's repetitive, exhausting, and oddly mesmerizing. The veteran rower beside you notices the way you're staring blankly at the oar handle. "Don't fall asleep," he whispers. You blink. Sleep? People do. That seems unlikely until you realise the motion is almost like rocking in a cradle. Some rowers apparently drift into half-sleep while still moving in rhythm. Historians still argue whether this trance-like rowing state helped endurance, or simply proved how mentally exhausting the work was. Either way, you're beginning to understand why sailors describe rowing as a strange mixture of torture and meditation. Time stretches oddly down here. Without a view of the horizon, hours blur together into endless cycles of pulling and breathing. Then something interesting happens. The drum suddenly stops. Every oar lifts slightly from the water. The ship slows. You hear voices above deck, louder now, orders being shouted. The veteran leans closer. "Harbour," he says. Your heart lifts slightly. A break. Soon the ship turns gently, and faint sounds drift down through the hull. Gulls crying, ropes creaking, distant voices from a shoreline market. After what feels like an eternity, the command comes. Hold. The rowers rest their oars across the hull, and suddenly your arms feel like wet rope. You flex your fingers slowly. The palms are already forming blisters. Around you, men stretch cautiously, rolling their shoulders and adjusting stiff legs. The hatch above opens, letting in a beam of sunlight so bright it feels almost supernatural. Fresh air pours in. For a moment the entire rowing deck breathes like a single creature. Now you finally see the harbour. A busy Mediterranean port filled with fishing boats, merchant vessels, and a few other sleek warships like your own. The smell of cooking food drifts faintly across the water. It might be the most beautiful thing you've experienced all day. There's another curious historical detail here. Unlike later naval fleets, many ancient warships didn't stay at sea overnight unless absolutely necessary. Instead, they preferred stopping at friendly coasts or beaches where the ship could be pulled onto land. That meant rowers often had to do something after their exhausting day of rowing. They helped haul the ship out of the water. Yes, really. Imagine finishing a marathon and then being asked to move a truck. Historians still debate how exactly these hauling operations worked. Some believe rollers were placed under the hull, while others think large crews simply dragged the ship across wet sand. Either way, the job required a lot of tired rowers, and guess who qualifies perfectly for that description? The overseer claps his hands. "Up! Move!" You slowly climb from the bench, legs stiff and shaky. After hours of rowing in a cramped position, standing feels strangely unfamiliar. Sunlight hits your face as you step onto the deck. For the first time today, you can finally see the ship properly. It's long, narrow, and incredibly low to the water. A sharp bronze ram protrudes from the front like the beak of a metal bird. That ram is the ship's primary weapon, designed to punch holes in enemy vessels during battle, which means this elegant machine is essentially a floating spear, and you are one of the muscles pushing it forward. The crew begins tying ropes to the dock. Around you, the harbour bustles with life. Fishermen shouting, merchants bargaining, sailors repairing sails. Compared to the quiet misery below deck, the world above feels loud and chaotic. The veteran rower stretches his back and sighs. "Enjoy the break," he says. "How long do we stop?" He shrugs. "Long enough to eat." You glance back at the dark hatch leading down to the rowing benches. It already feels like a place you'd rather not return to. Unfortunately, tomorrow the drum will beat again, and when it does, the floating prison beneath this elegant warship will be waiting patiently for you. You don't get long to enjoy the harbour. The brief rest passes quickly. A few mouthfuls of coarse bread, a drink of watered wine, and a chance to stretch muscles that still feel like twisted rope. The sun climbs higher, gulls circle overhead, and the pleasant noise of the port almost makes you forget where you're headed next. Almost. Because before long the overseer begins shouting again. "Back aboard!" The order spreads along the dock like an unpleasant rumour. Rowers groan quietly as they climb back onto the ship. You follow the others down the narrow hatch, ducking your head under the beam as you return to the lower deck. The warm, stale air greets you like an old enemy. Your bench is exactly where you left it. Narrow, unforgiving, and already beginning to feel strangely familiar. You slide back into place, gripping the smooth wooden handle of the oar. Across the deck, rowers settle into position with practiced movements. Veterans brace their feet automatically against the wooden bar, adjusting posture the way a craftsman adjusts his tools. You try to copy them. The veteran beside you glances over. "First real training today," he mutters. You frown. "I thought we were already rowing," he chuckles. "That was the easy part." That statement hangs in the air like a storm cloud. Ancient naval crews took synchronized rowing extremely seriously. A trireme only moved efficiently if every oar entered and left the water at exactly the same moment. If the timing was off, the oars would collide or drag unevenly, slowing the ship dramatically, which meant training was essential, especially for newcomers like you. The overseer walks slowly down the aisle, watching everyone closely. "Listen for the beat," he says. "Not your arms, not the water, the beat." At the front of the ship, the drummer raises his sticks again. This time the rhythm starts slow. Boom, you lean forward. Boom, you pull back. At first it seems manageable, but soon the pace changes. The drum speeds up slightly. Boom! Boom! The ship begins moving again, gliding away from the harbour. The water splashes rhythmically against the hull as dozens of oars dip in perfect sequence, or at least that's the goal. 2 benches ahead, someone mistimes a stroke. The oars collide with a loud crack. The overseer immediately slaps his stick against the beam. Again! The rhythm restarts, and suddenly you realise something important about rowing on a warship. It's less like casual paddling, and more like performing in a giant wooden orchestra where every musician holds a 12-foot paddle. Ancient historians actually wrote about the incredible coordination required. The famous historian Thucydides described naval warfare in the Mediterranean as a contest not just of bravery, but of disciplined rowing crews, which means your aching shoulders are technically part of military strategy. Congratulations. The drumbeat changes again. Faster. Boom. Pull. Boom. Pull. Your breathing begins matching the rhythm without you realising it. Around you the rowers move like parts of a single machine. The ship slices through the water more quickly now, the hull vibrating gently with each stroke. The veteran beside you whispers between breaths. "Don't yank the oar." You glance over. "Push your legs, then pull." You try it, and surprisingly, it works. Instead of dragging the oar with just your arms, you push with your legs against the brace, letting your whole body drive the movement. The stroke suddenly feels smoother, still exhausting, but smoother. There's actually a mainstream historical fact behind this technique. Ancient rowing manuals and modern reconstructions of triremes suggest rowers used their legs heavily to generate power, not just their arms. So in a strange way, you're participating in one of the earliest forms of full-body athletic training, except without the motivational music, or comfortable clothing, or the option to stop. The sun climbs higher outside and the air below deck grows steadily warmer. Sweat drips from your forehead. The wood beneath your feet becomes slippery. The rhythm continues. Pull, breathe, pull. Time begins to blur again. Then the drummer suddenly changes the beat. Boom! Boom! The stroke doubles in speed. Panic flickers through the rowing benches as everyone struggles to keep up. "Battle pace," someone whispers. This is the speed used when warships prepare for combat, when they need to close distance quickly or maneuver against enemy vessels. Even during practice, the tempo is brutal. Your shoulders scream in protest. The oar feels twice as heavy. Muscles in your back tighten like iron cables. But the rhythm does not slow. Historians still argue about exactly how long rowers could maintain these intense battle speeds. Some estimates suggest only a few minutes before exhaustion forced the crew back to a slower pace, which makes sense. After 30 seconds, you're already questioning your life choices. The overseer watches carefully. "Keep the line!" 2 more oars clash loudly. The ship wobbles slightly as the rhythm breaks. The drum stops. For a moment there is silence except for the heavy breathing of 170 exhausted men. Then the overseer sighs. "We try again." You slump slightly on the bench. Apparently training on an ancient warship involves repeating the same painful exercise until everyone moves perfectly in sync, which could take quite a while. Outside, the sea stretches endlessly under the bright Mediterranean sun. The ship glides through calm water, preparing its human engine for the moment when speed might mean survival. Down here below deck, though, things feel simpler. Your hands are blistering, your back aches, and the drumbeat is about to start again. The sticks rise, the first boom echoes through the hull, and like every other rower around you, you lean forward and prepare to pull. By the time the drum finally slows again, your arms feel like they belong to someone else. Not in a good way. The ship glides steadily across calm water now, the oars dipping in a relaxed rhythm instead of the frantic pace from earlier. Even so, every pull reminds you that muscles have limits, and yours are already negotiating terms of surrender. You shift slightly on the bench. Bad idea. Your lower back protests immediately. The narrow plank beneath you seems designed to punish even the smallest movement. The veteran rower beside you notices your grimace. Bench bites back, he says quietly. You glance down at the hard wooden plank. It suddenly feels less like furniture, and more like a long-term enemy. This is the reality of life chained to the oar. Now, despite what some dramatic movies show, historians believe most rowers on classical warships were not literally chained to their benches during normal operations. Being shackled would make it impossible to escape quickly if the ship sank, and ancient sailors were practical people when it came to survival. But the phrase, chained to the bench, still captures the feeling perfectly. Because once you're seated here, you don't leave until the overseer says so. The rowing deck is long and narrow, barely wide enough for a man to move down the aisle. Oars extend through small openings in the hull, each one sliding back and forth through a leather sleeve that keeps water from pouring inside. Above you, another row of oars moves in perfect rhythm. Below you, another row does the same. 3 levels of men stacked like living gears in a wooden machine. The design was incredibly advanced for its time. Shipbuilders across the Mediterranean refined the trireme over centuries, creating a vessel capable of surprising speed and agility. One famous historical example is the naval fleet of Athens, which relied heavily on these ships during the 5th century BCE. Their naval power helped shape the balance of power across the entire region. Of course, none of those grand political consequences are very comforting when you're sitting on a bench that feels like a medieval torture device. The overseer passes through again. Straight backs, he says. You quickly adjust your posture. Rowers sit upright not just for discipline but for efficiency. Lean too far forward or back and the oar loses power. Sit crooked and you disrupt the timing of the rowers beside you, which means even your posture is part of the ship's engine. The drumbeat continues. Boom, pull, boom, pull. You begin noticing strange details about life down here. For example, the constant creaking of wood. Every stroke of the oars makes the hull flex slightly. It's not alarming, just the sound of a living machine doing its work. Then there's the smell. You've stopped noticing it as much, which is either a sign of adaptation or surrender. Sweat drips steadily from rowers' faces. The heat below deck builds throughout the day, especially when the sun climbs high overhead. There are no windows, no breeze, just warm air thick with effort. Every so often a sailor walks through carrying a bucket of water. Rowers take quick drinks between strokes, careful not to lose the rhythm. Hydration matters, because ancient naval campaigns could involve hours of rowing in open seas. Here's an odd historical tidbit. Archaeologists studying ancient ships have found evidence that rowers sometimes used small cushions or folded cloths to soften their benches. Unfortunately, those luxuries were not always available, which explains why experienced rowers occasionally stand up slightly between strokes when the drum slows just to relieve pressure on their backsides. You try it briefly. It helps. A little, but not enough. The veteran beside you stretches his fingers carefully. Hands first, he says. You look down. Blisters. Several of them. The wooden oar handle is smooth but relentless, rubbing against your palms with every stroke. Soon those blisters will harden into calluses. That's the unofficial badge of an experienced rower. Historians still argue about how long it took for new crews to reach full efficiency. Some estimates suggest several weeks of training before a rowing team could perform complex battle maneuvers smoothly, which means your arms may still have many unpleasant days ahead. The ship tilts slightly as it turns across the waves. From above deck comes the sound of voices, officers discussing navigation, perhaps scanning the horizon for other ships. Down here, though, the world is reduced to a simple cycle. Pull, breathe, pull again. You start recognizing the subtle signals of the drum. A slower beat means cruising speed. A sharper beat means maneuvering. And that terrifying rapid rhythm from earlier means the ship is trying to move as fast as possible. That's the one you hope not to hear again today. A rower farther down the bench suddenly coughs. The overseer glances over. "Keep rowing," he says calmly. The man nods and continues. Life on a warship leaves little room for comfort, but occasionally the monotony breaks. Suddenly a shout comes from above deck. "Sail on the horizon!" The drum stops instantly. Every oar freezes mid-air. The entire rowing deck falls silent. You exchange glances with the rower beside you. A ship, out there somewhere on the open sea. Friend or enemy? No one down here knows yet, but one thing is certain. If the officers above decide that ship is hostile, the drumbeat you heard earlier, the one that nearly broke your arms, is about to return. And this time, it won't be practice. The silence after the lookout's shout lingers for a long moment. Every oar remains frozen just above the water. Your muscles tremble slightly from holding the weight, but no one dares move until the order comes from above. Somewhere on deck, officers are peering across the bright sea, trying to decide whether the distant sail is a harmless merchant ship, or something more dangerous. Finally, the command arrives. Stand easy. The oars lower gently, resting against the hull. A wave of quiet relief passes through the rowing deck as rowers loosen their grips and roll their shoulders. The veteran beside you exhales slowly. Probably nothing, he murmurs. You hope he's right, because if it were an enemy vessel, the drum would already be hammering out the frantic rhythm of battle speed. Instead, the ship continues drifting calmly. Above deck, the officers' voices fade into normal conversation, and after a few minutes, the drum resumes its slower cruising beat. Boom, pull, boom, pull. The ordinary misery of rowing returns. By now your body is starting to understand the routine of this floating machine. Lean forward, push with the legs, pull the oar through the water, breathe out, repeat endlessly. It's not elegant work, but it is strangely effective. A well-trained trireme could reach speeds of around 7 or 8 knots for short bursts. Impressive for a vessel powered entirely by human muscle. Naval powers of the ancient Mediterranean depended on this speed to outmaneuver enemy ships, which means every aching rower down here is part of a military engine. Unfortunately, engines require fuel, and that brings us to the daily menu. After another stretch of rowing, a sailor begins moving down the aisle with a wooden bucket and a stack of small clay cups. The smell hits you before the cup reaches your hand. Barley porridge. Thin, watery, but technically edible. You take the cup gratefully anyway. Your stomach has been rumbling since the harbour stop, and even bland food tastes good after hours of rowing. This was a common staple across the ancient Mediterranean, especially in places like ancient Greece. Barley was cheap, durable, and easy to cook in large quantities, perfect for feeding crews of hungry sailors. You swallow a few quick mouthfuls between strokes of the oar. It's warm, slightly salty, and not nearly enough. Next comes water, not fresh water exactly. More like slightly stale water stored in clay jars. Still, it's precious. Ships had limited supplies, and careful rationing was necessary during long journeys. The sailor pours a small amount into your cup. You drink it slowly. Hydration matters when your entire day involves pulling heavy wood through the sea. Sweat continues dripping down your back. The heat below deck has grown almost tropical now, the air thick with the smell of effort. Rowers wipe their faces with the edges of their tunics. A man across the aisle mutters something about wishing for wine instead of water. Another rower laughs quietly. Funny enough, diluted wine was actually common on ancient ships. Mixing wine with water helped preserve it, and made questionable water supplies a bit safer to drink. Historians still argue exactly how much alcohol crews consumed at sea, but it certainly wasn't the endless drunkenness sometimes imagined in pirate stories. Rowing drunk would be disastrous. You imagine 170 rowers trying to coordinate their strokes after several cups of strong wine, and quickly decide that sober rowing is probably safer for everyone involved. The porridge bucket moves on. The brief meal barely interrupts the rhythm of rowing. Most men eat with one hand while guiding the oar with the other. Efficiency is everything here. The veteran beside you wipes his mouth and leans closer. You get used to it. To the food. To everything. You glance down the long row of benches. Dozens of men pull their oars in perfect rhythm, faces shining with sweat, bodies rocking slightly with each stroke. It's hard to imagine getting used to this, but apparently many do. Here's a curious historical detail. Some experienced rowers reportedly developed incredible endurance, capable of rowing for hours while maintaining a steady pace. Modern experiments with reconstructed triremes suggest that trained crews could maintain moderate speeds for extended periods, though the work remained brutally tiring, which explains why ancient fleets carefully organised shifts and rest periods during long voyages. Right now, though, rest feels like a distant dream. The drumbeat continues, pull, breathe, pull again. Your arms are starting to feel numb in that strange way muscles do when they've worked beyond their normal limits. At some point the pain stops increasing and simply settles into a constant background complaint. You've entered what might be called the rower's trance. Historians sometimes speculate that this repetitive rhythm could become almost meditative, or perhaps mildly maddening, hard to say which. Somewhere above deck a sailor begins singing, a slow, rhythmic sea song that drifts faintly through the wooden beams. A few rowers below deck quietly hum along between breaths. It's not cheerful music, but it keeps time with the strokes. Another quirky tidbit from maritime history. Sea songs like this may have helped coordinate labour long before modern metronomes or recorded music existed. Humans, it turns out, are very good at synchronizing effort with rhythm, which is fortunate, because if the rowers fall out of rhythm, the entire ship slows. The sun begins descending toward the western horizon. You can't see it from down here, but the changing light filtering through the oar ports gives it away. Evening is approaching. Soon the officers will start looking for a safe place to beach the ship for the night. And when that moment arrives, your day of rowing will finally end. Unfortunately, as the veteran warned earlier, that doesn't necessarily mean the work is over, because a trireme may glide gracefully across the sea. But getting it out of the water is another story entirely. By the time evening approaches, your body has discovered new and exciting ways to feel exhausted. Your shoulders ache, your back complains, your hands sting every time the oar shifts in your grip, and yet the drumbeat continues, calm and steady, pushing the ship forward across the open water. Somewhere above deck, the lookout shouts something about the coastline ahead. You can't see it from where you sit, but you can feel the ship subtly changing direction. The oars on one side slow while the others pull harder, gently turning the long hull toward land. For a moment hope flickers. Maybe tonight will bring rest. But the sea, as it often does, has other plans. The first warning is small, a gentle roll beneath the ship. You barely notice it at first. The oar dips slightly deeper into the water, then rises again as the hull tilts the opposite way. The veteran beside you glances upward. "Wind picking up," he mutters. Within minutes the movement grows stronger. The calm surface of the sea transforms into rolling waves that slap rhythmically against the hull. The oars begin dipping unevenly as the ship rides up and down. Rowing in calm water is exhausting. Rowing in rough water is something else entirely. The drummer adjusts the rhythm slightly, slowing the beat to help the crew maintain control. Boom, pull, boom, pull. But the ship now rocks beneath you with each passing swell. Sometimes the oar blade bites deep into the water, forcing your arms to strain harder than expected. Other times the blade barely catches anything at all as the ship rises on a wave. Your muscles struggle to adapt. Then comes the nausea. It starts as a faint uneasiness in your stomach, the kind of feeling you might get after too much spinning around as a child. The rolling motion of the ship turns the world into a slow, endless tilt. Forward, back, up, down. Across the rowing benches, several men shift uncomfortably. The veteran sighs. "First storm?" "Storm," you whisper nervously. He shrugs. "Maybe just waves." That distinction does not feel particularly comforting. Ancient sailors were extremely familiar with these sudden changes in weather. The Mediterranean Sea, despite its reputation for beauty, could turn rough surprisingly quickly. Without modern forecasting tools, crews often relied on experience and observation, and sometimes luck. The ship crests a larger wave. Water splashes through the lower oar ports. You glance down just in time to see a small stream trickle across the floorboards near the feet of the lowest rowers. Those poor souls, the thalamitae, sit only inches above the waterline. When the sea grows rough, they receive the full splash of every wave, which means they spend part of the journey rowing with wet feet, or sometimes wet everything. You silently thank the gods of geography for your slightly higher seat. Another wave hits. The ship lurches sideways. Your stomach lurches with it. A rower farther down suddenly retches loudly over the side of his bench. No one even reacts. Apparently seasickness is a normal part of the job. Historians still argue how common this problem was among ancient rowing crews. Some believe experienced sailors eventually adapted to the motion, while others think many rowers simply suffered through it repeatedly. Either way, vomiting on a warship was not exactly rare. The overseer walks calmly through the aisle, steady despite the rolling deck. "Ice forward," he says firmly. Follow the beat. That advice turns out to be helpful. Instead of watching the shifting horizon through the oarport, you focus entirely on the drum. Boom, pull, boom, pull. The rhythm becomes an anchor in the chaos of the waves. Even as the ship rocks violently, the drum beat remains steady, guiding every movement. Outside, the wind whistles faintly along the hull. Ancient ships like this relied heavily on skilled navigation and careful coastal sailing. Mariners often preferred hugging shorelines rather than venturing too far into open water. It reduced the risk of getting lost and provided shelter when weather changed suddenly. Places like the Mediterranean Sea were dotted with natural harbours and small islands that could offer protection during rough conditions. Hopefully the officers above are steering toward one of them now. Another swell lifts the ship sharply. Your oar momentarily rises clear of the water before crashing back down into the next wave. The jolt nearly pulls your arms from their sockets. "Easy," the overseer calls. The drummer slows the rhythm again. Gradually the ship settles into a slower pace, allowing the crew to maintain control despite the waves. The rocking continues, though, relentless and unpredictable, and unfortunately, your stomach is still negotiating with gravity. The veteran beside you chuckles softly. "First few trips are worst," you glare at him weakly. "Good to know." He nods toward the oar. "Keep pulling." Because on a warship, even seasickness does not excuse you from the rhythm. The sun is setting now. You can see the golden glow reflecting through the oar ports. Shadows stretch across the rowing deck as evening approaches. Somewhere out there beyond the waves lies the coastline the lookout spotted earlier. If the crew reaches it before the wind worsens, the ship will be hauled safely onto a beach for the night. If not, well, let's just say ancient sailors had many creative ways to spend uncomfortable nights at sea. For now, though, the drumbeat continues. Your arms keep moving, the waves keep rolling, and the long warship pushes stubbornly onward through the restless evening water. The waves keep rolling long after the sun disappears. By now the sky above the ship has turned a deep shade of purple, though you only see hints of it through the thin strips of fading light filtering down the oarports. The rowing deck grows dim, lit mostly by small oil lamps hanging along the beams. The air feels heavier at night, warmer, more crowded somehow, and the ship still hasn't stopped. You were hoping the officers would find a beach before darkness arrived. Ancient warships preferred sleeping on land whenever possible, partly for safety, partly because these long, narrow vessels weren't designed for comfortable overnight living. But sometimes the coast doesn't cooperate, and sometimes the sea refuses to calm down. The drum continues its slow rhythm. Boom, pull, boom, pull. The rocking from earlier waves has settled slightly, but the water remains restless. Every few strokes your oar hits a small swell, sending a splash across the lower benches. Down below, the thalamite mutter quietly as another trickle of water runs along the floorboards. The veteran beside you sighs, probably rowing through the night. Your heart sinks a little. You are beginning to think the day might actually end, but apparently life on an ancient warship runs on a simple rule. If the ship is moving, the rowers are working, and right now, the ship is definitely moving. A lantern swings gently from a beam above you, casting long shadows across the benches. The dim light makes the rows of rowers look almost ghost-like, bodies leaning forward and back in endless rhythm. Pull, breathe, pull again. After hours of repetition, your body moves almost automatically. The rhythm has burrowed deep into your muscles. Even when your mind drifts, your arms continue the motion. Historians sometimes describe this as a kind of rowing trance. Not exactly relaxation, more like mechanical survival. Your thoughts wander as the drum continues beating. You imagine the ship from outside, the long narrow hull slicing through dark water, oars flashing in the lantern light like the legs of some enormous sea creature. These vessels were marvels of ancient engineering. Naval powers such as ancient Athens built fleets of hundreds of triremes during the height of their power, each ship requiring nearly 200 men to operate. That means thousands of rowers working together to move a single navy, which is impressive, but also slightly terrifying when you realise you're one of them. Somewhere above deck, a lookout suddenly shouts again. Voices respond immediately. The drum stops. Every oar freezes mid-stroke. The rowing deck falls silent except for the creaking of wood and the distant slap of waves against the hull. You glance toward the veteran. What now? He listens carefully. Then he mutters one word. Ships. Your stomach tightens. Even from below deck you can hear the shift in tone above. Orders are being given quickly now. Footsteps run across the planks. Armour clinks softly as Marines prepare themselves. The overseer walks briskly down the aisle. Stand ready. You grip the oar tighter. A few moments pass, then the drum begins again. But this time the rhythm is different. Fast, sharp, urgent. Boom, boom. Battle pace, the overseer shouts. Suddenly every rower throws his weight into the stroke. The oar plunges deep into the water. Pull, forward, pull again. Your shoulders explode with effort as the ship surges ahead. The entire hull vibrates with power as 170 men push it to maximum speed. This is what triremes were built for. Ancient naval combat relied heavily on speed and manoeuvrability. Warships aimed to outflank their enemies, striking with the bronze ram mounted at the bow. That ram, a heavy metal beak, could smash through the side of an enemy vessel if the attack landed correctly. Which means the faster your ship moves, the more dangerous it becomes. The drumbeat grows even faster. Boom! 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 Your lungs burn as you struggle to keep pace. The rowers around you grunt with effort, bodies straining against the oars. Somewhere above, the officers shout commands. The ship turns sharply. The sudden change of direction nearly knocks your oar from your hands. Keep the line, the overseer roars. You grit your teeth and pull harder. Historians still argue exactly how chaotic ancient naval battles became once fleets collided. Some believe skilled crews maintained careful formations, while others suggest combat quickly dissolved into frantic manoeuvring. From down here, though, the situation feels very simple. Row faster, or the ship doesn't move. And if the ship doesn't move, well, you'd rather not think about what happens then. Another shout echoes from above. The drum accelerates again. Your muscles scream. The oar feels impossibly heavy now, yet somehow you keep pulling. Every rower around you is doing the same, driven by fear, adrenaline, and the relentless rhythm of the drum. The ship lunges forward through the dark water. Faster, closer, somewhere out there in the night. Another ship is waiting. And if the officers above are right, you're about to discover what happens when two ancient warships meet at full speed. The drumbeat becomes almost violent. Boom! 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 Each strike echoes through the wooden hull like a hammer inside a barrel. The rhythm is so fast now that there's barely time to breathe between strokes. Pull, forward, pull again. The trireme surges across the dark water, driven by the desperate effort of every rower aboard. Your shoulders burn with an intensity that feels almost unreal, as if someone replaced your muscles with hot iron rods. Above deck, the shouting grows louder. You hear the scrape of shields, the clatter of spears, the sharp commands of officers trying to position the ship. The veteran beside you mutters under his breath. Here we go. You don't need to ask what he means. Even down here, below the deck, you can feel the tension building through the ship. The hull vibrates with speed, slicing through the waves like a spear through cloth. Somewhere ahead, another vessel is doing the exact same thing. Ancient naval warfare depended heavily on speed and manoeuvring. Warships tried to ram each other from the side or rear, using the heavy bronze ram mounted at the bow. This brutal tactic was perfected during the great naval battles of the classical Mediterranean world, especially by fleets such as those of Athens. Their ships were famous for executing complex maneuvers designed to break enemy formations. But none of those clever strategies feel very comforting when you're the human engine pushing the ship forward. The overseer walks quickly down the aisle. Harder, he shouts. You pull with everything you have left. The oar plunges deep into the water, dragging your entire body backward as the ship lunges ahead. The drumbeat rises again. Boom! 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 Your breathing becomes ragged. Sweat pours down your face. Around you, the rowers grunt with effort, bodies rocking violently with each stroke. Then suddenly, the drum stops. The oars freeze. The entire ship seems to hold its breath. For one strange moment there is only silence, and then the impact comes. Crash! The sound is enormous. Wood smashing against wood with a brutal grinding force that shakes the entire hull. The ship jolts violently, throwing several rowers forward on their benches. Your oar jerks in your hands. Somewhere above deck, men shout triumphantly. The veteran beside you grins grimly. Hit them. You swallow. So that's what a successful ram feels like. At the front of the ship, the The bronze ram has likely punched into the side of the enemy vessel, tearing open planks below the waterline. That was the goal of ancient naval combat. Cripple the enemy ship quickly, leaving it unable to maneuver. Once disabled, Marines aboard your ship could board the enemy and fight hand-to-hand on the deck. Down here below, though, your job isn't finished, because ramming an enemy vessel creates another problem: getting unstuck. The overseer shouts again, "Backwater!" The drummer strikes a new rhythm. Boom, push, boom, push again. Instead of pulling the oar normally, you now push forward, forcing the blade through the water in reverse. The goal is to back the ship away before the enemy crew can climb aboard. Rowers lean forward with every ounce of strength they have left. Push, push again. The hull shudders as the ram pulls free from shattered wood. Above deck comes the sound of shouting, splintering boards, and the distant crash of waves slapping against two struggling ships. Historians still argue how often ramming actually sank enemy vessels outright. Some scholars believe many ships were simply damaged rather than destroyed, leading to chaotic boarding fights afterward. From your position below deck, though, the battle feels strangely abstract. You don't see the enemy. You don't see the damage. You only feel the consequences. The drumbeat suddenly changes again. "Forward!" the overseer roars. The oars plunge back into the water. Pull, pull harder. The ship surges away from the wreckage, turning sharply as the helmsman steers toward open water. Your arms tremble violently now, muscles pushed far beyond their normal limits, but the rhythm continues. Pull, breathe, pull again. Above deck, the clash of combat grows fainter as your ship retreats from the damaged enemy vessel. The veteran beside you glances upward. "Looks like we're not boarding," he says. You're not sure whether to feel relieved or disappointed. Boarding battles were terrifying, but they also meant the rowers might get a brief rest while the Marines fought. Instead, the drum keeps beating. The ship continues manoeuvring through the dark water, ready to strike again if necessary. After several long minutes, the rhythm finally slows. The oars dip gently into the waves. Your arms sag with exhaustion. The veteran wipes sweat from his forehead and chuckles softly. "Congratulations," he says. You glance over weakly. For what? Your first naval battle. You stare down at your blistered hands. Your shoulders ache. Your back feels like it's made of splintered wood. And you realise something slightly unsettling. That violent crash, the moment when two warships smashed together in the darkness, was probably just the beginning of a very long night. The ship doesn't slow immediately after the collision. In fact, for several tense minutes the drum keeps beating at a steady pace as the helmsman guides the trireme through the dark water, creating distance between your ship and the damaged enemy vessel behind you. Your arms are trembling now, not just tired, trembling in that strange way muscles do when they've been pushed far beyond their comfort zone. Still, the oar keeps moving. Pull, breathe, pull again. Eventually the rhythm softens, the drumbeat slows, and the ship settles into a calmer glide across the night sea. The frantic energy of battle begins fading into the quieter exhaustion of survival. Above deck, voices still shout back and forth, but they sound less urgent now. The enemy ship, if it's still afloat, has clearly fallen behind. The veteran beside you finally relaxes his grip slightly. "Looks like they're done," he mutters. You glance toward the oarport where faint moonlight flickers across the surface of the water. "Done?" you ask quietly. He nods. If the ram hit below the waterline, they'll be sinking. That thought sends a chill through you, because if the enemy ship is sinking, the rowers aboard it might still be sitting exactly where you are right now, trapped on their benches. Ancient warships were incredibly fast and deadly, but they were not designed with easy escape routes for the hundreds of men packed inside. When a vessel was rammed badly enough, the lower hull could flood quickly, which meant rowers sometimes had only seconds to react. Historians still argue about how often crews were able to escape in those situations. Some accounts suggest experienced rowers could scramble out quickly through the upper decks. Others imply that many men never made it out at all. It's one of the darker realities of ancient naval warfare. From your seat on the bench, you imagine the scene on that enemy ship. Water rushing through shattered planks, rowers struggling to free themselves, the hull slowly tipping as the sea claims another vessel. You shiver slightly, the veteran notices. "Don't think about it," he says, easy for him to say. The drumbeat stops. For the first time since the battle began, The oars rest quietly along the hull. A deep silence settles across the rowing deck. Rowers flex stiff fingers and roll aching shoulders. Several men lean forward, catching their breath after the brutal burst of battle rowing. Above deck, the officers are still discussing something, perhaps deciding whether to pursue other ships or continue toward land. You take the opportunity to examine your hands. The blisters from earlier have grown worse. One has already split open slightly, leaving a thin smear of blood on the wooden handle of the oar. A veteran rower across the aisle notices and grins sympathetically. First battle scars, you try not to look too miserable. The ship creaks gently as it drifts across the calm water. Without the constant rowing motion, the vessel feels almost peaceful, rocking softly under the moonlight. For a brief moment, you almost forget where you are. Then a splash echoes through the darkness outside. Several rowers glance toward the oar ports. Another splash follows, then a faint voice. "Help!" The word carries weakly across the water. You freeze. Someone out there is shouting. Another voice joins it, then another. Survivors. The enemy ship must have sunk, leaving its crew struggling in the sea. Ancient naval battles often ended this way. Once a vessel was crippled, its crew might jump overboard rather than drown with the ship. Those lucky enough to survive the sinking sometimes clung to floating debris, hoping another vessel might rescue them. Whether rescue actually happened depended heavily on the situation. Sometimes victorious crews pulled survivors from the water. Other times, they sailed away. Historians still debate how common mercy was in these situations. Ancient warfare could be pragmatic. Saving prisoners might be useful. But it could also be brutally efficient. Your ship slows slightly. Footsteps move across the deck above. The veteran tilts his head, listening carefully. "Let's see what the captain decides," he murmurs. The splashing voices outside grow louder. "Please! Help!" The cries echo across the dark sea. Down below, the rowers sit quietly listening. You grip the oar loosely, waiting for the next command. If the order comes to resume rowing, the ship will leave these men behind in the darkness. If the order comes to stop, then ropes might be thrown into the water. For now, the decision rests with the officers above deck, and somewhere beyond the hull of your ship, the survivors of that shattered warship continue calling out across the quiet Mediterranean night. For a while, no one moves. The cries from the water drift across the sea, carried by the quiet wind. From the rowing benches below deck, you and the others sit in an uneasy silence, listening to the desperate voices echo in the darkness. "Help!" Another splash. Then another weak call. Above deck, boots move quickly across the planks. Officers are clearly discussing something, their voices low but urgent. Decisions are being made, the kind of decisions that matter a great deal to the men floating outside the hull. The veteran beside you stares at the oar blade resting in the water. "Depends on the captain," he says quietly. "Depends on what?" "Whether we have time." That answer doesn't feel comforting. Ancient naval warfare was often brutally practical. Stopping to rescue survivors could slow a fleet or expose ships to danger from other enemies nearby. Sometimes commanders chose mercy, sometimes they chose speed. For a few tense moments, the rowing deck remains still. Then the drum sounds again. One single beat. Boom! The overseer immediately shouts the command. "Row!" Your heart sinks slightly. The oars dip into the water. Pull, pull again. The ship begins moving forward. The cries from the water fade slowly behind you. No one says anything, but the message is clear enough. Tonight, the ship sails on. The rhythm returns, steady and quiet this time. Not the frantic pace of battle, just the slow movement of a vessel continuing its journey across dark water. You try not to think about the men left behind. Instead, you focus on the oar, the drum, the motion. Pull, breathe, pull again. Eventually the veteran breaks the silence. "Happens," he mutters. You glance at him. "That's all?" He shrugs. "At sea, you learn to keep rowing." The lantern above your bench swings gently with the ship's movement, casting long shadows across the rowers. Faces appear and disappear in the flickering light, each man locked in his own quiet thoughts. Life on a warship doesn't leave much room for reflection. Still, the image lingers in your mind. Hands reaching from the water, voices calling into the darkness. The ship creaks softly as it moves through the calm sea. Somewhere ahead, the coastline is still waiting. But the night isn't finished with you yet. The overseer walks slowly down the aisle, tapping his stick against the beams. "Keep the line," he says. You nod slightly and adjust your grip on the oar. The blisters on your hands sting with every stroke now. Salt water has worked its way into the small cuts, creating a sharp, burning sensation that reminds you constantly how long you've been rowing. A rower farther down the bench quietly wraps a strip of cloth around his palm. Small tricks like that make a difference over time. Here's an interesting historical detail. Crews on ancient warships often developed their own little techniques for survival. Rowers learned how to wrap their hands, stretch their backs, or shift their weight slightly to reduce fatigue during long journeys. Over months or years at sea, these habits became second nature. Veterans knew exactly how to preserve their strength. Newcomers like you learned the hard way. The drumbeat continues. Boom, pull, boom, pull. Above deck the wind has settled, and the sea grows calmer again. The earlier waves fade into a gentle swell that lifts the ship slowly up and down. Your body begins falling back into that strange rowing trance. The veteran notices your distant stare. "Mind drifting?" he asks. "A little." He nods knowingly. "Careful with that." "Why?" "Because if the drum changes suddenly..." He taps the oar handle lightly. "You better notice." That's good advice. Ancient naval combat depended on quick reactions. If the helmsman needed a sudden turn, or if another enemy ship appeared, the rowers had to change pace instantly. A slow response could ruin a manoeuvre, or worse. Historians still argue about just how complex these manoeuvres became in real battles. Some descriptions suggest fleets performed carefully coordinated turns, such as the famous Diekplaus manoeuvre, where ships broke through enemy lines before attacking from behind. But those strategies only worked if the rowing crews responded perfectly, which means the success of entire naval campaigns sometimes depended on men sitting on benches like yours. A strange thought. You pull the oar through the water again. The rhythm continues. Pull, breathe, pull again. Far ahead, the faint outline of land finally appears against the moonlit horizon. The lookout shouts from above. "Coast ahead!" A quiet wave of relief spreads through the rowing deck. Land means rest, at least for a few hours. But before anyone can celebrate, the veteran beside you chuckles softly. You remember what happens next, right? You frown. "What?" He grins tiredly. "We get to pull the ship out of the water." "Right. Because rowing all day across the Mediterranean apparently isn't enough exercise for one evening. The drumbeat finally stops. For a few seconds, nobody moves. Your oar rests lightly against the surface of the water, the blade drifting in the moonlit ripples. After hours of relentless pulling, the sudden stillness feels almost unreal, like stepping off a spinning wheel that hasn't quite stopped turning. Then the overseer claps his hands. "Raise oars!" All along the length of the ship, the rowers lift their oars out of the water and rest them against the hull. The sea laps gently against the wooden planks as the trireme coasts toward the dark shape of the coastline ahead. Above deck, sailors shout instructions while ropes are prepared. You finally allow yourself a long breath. Land. Real land. Even if it's just a narrow strip of sand somewhere along the Mediterranean coast, it still feels like paradise compared to the cramped bench you've been glued to all day. The veteran beside you stretches slowly, joints popping. "Almost there," he mutters. Through the oarport you catch a glimpse of the shoreline sliding closer. Dark rocks, pale sand, and the faint outline of a low hills under the moonlight. The helmsman guides the ship carefully toward the beach. Ancient warships like this one were designed to be light enough that crews could pull them ashore each night, protecting the hull from waves and surprise attacks. It was a routine practiced by fleets all across the region, especially by naval powers like ancient Athens. Their triremes were famous not just for speed, but for how quickly crews could land, rest, and launch again the next day. Which means you're about to participate in the next charming tradition of naval life: manual ship hauling. The keel scrapes softly against the sand. "Out!" the overseer shouts. Rowers climb awkwardly from their benches, legs stiff after the long day. You stretch your back and feel several alarming cracks along your spine. Standing upright feels strange now, almost like your body forgot how. You follow the others up onto the deck. The night air hits your face like a gift. Cool, fresh, glorious. After hours below deck, even the smell of seaweed and wet sand feels refreshing. The beach lies quiet under the moonlight. A few torches are planted in the sand, casting flickering light across the shoreline. Sailors jump into the shallow water, grabbing thick ropes tied to the ship's bow. Pull! You and dozens of others wade into the surf, boots sinking slightly into the wet sand. The water is cold around your ankles, but after the heat below deck it feels almost soothing. The rope stretches tight. Pull! Everyone leans back together. The ship shifts slightly. Pull again. Slowly, very slowly, as the Trireme begins sliding farther onto the beach. Historians believe ancient crews used a variety of methods to move these ships ashore. Some accounts suggest wooden rollers were placed beneath the hull, while others describe simple, brute force by large crews. Tonight it appears you're using the classic method. Lots of tired people pulling very hard. The veteran beside you grunts with effort. Almost easier than rowing, he jokes. You're not convinced. The ship moves another few feet up the sand. More sailors rush forward to wedge wooden blocks under the hull, securing it in place. Finally, the overseer raises a hand. Hold! Everyone releases the ropes. The Trireme now rests safely on the beach, its long hull gleaming faintly under the moonlight. For the first time all day, the ship is completely still. A quiet cheer spreads through the crew. Rowers stretch, rub aching shoulders, and shake out stiff arms. Some men simply sit down in the sand, too tired to move any farther. You drop beside them gratefully. The beach is cool and peaceful. Gentle waves whisper along the shoreline while the crew begins setting up a temporary camp. Fires are lit. Pots are placed over the flames. Someone passes around small bundles of dried fish and coarse bread. Tonight's dinner. You take a bite and sigh. After a day like this, even simple food tastes like a feast. The veteran chews thoughtfully beside you. You did all right, he says. For my first battle? For your first day. You stare out across the dark sea. Out there somewhere, another warship now rests at the bottom of the Mediterranean, its crew scattered across the waves. Down here on the sand, though, life continues. Fires crackle softly. Men talk quietly. And for a few precious hours, no one is asking you to row anything. But even during moments of rest, sailors have their traditions. Some are practical, others a little stranger. Ancient crews often carried superstitions with them across the sea. Small rituals meant to protect the ship and the men aboard it. And tonight, as the campfire burns low and the stars brighten overhead, you're about to learn just how seriously sailors take their strange little beliefs. The fire crackles softly as the crew settles along the beach. For the first time since sunrise, no drum is beating, no overseer is shouting, and no oars are scraping through the water. The long warship rests safely above the tide line, its sleek hull casting a dark shadow across the sand. You sit near the warmth of the fire, stretching sore fingers while chewing another piece of dried fish. It tastes like salt, mostly salt. But after a day of rowing, your stomach is willing to accept almost anything. Around you, small groups of sailors and rowers relax in quiet conversation. Some lie back on the sand staring up at the stars. Others carefully rub oil into aching shoulders and arms, a trick many experienced sailors swear by after long hours of labour. The veteran beside you pokes the fire with a stick. You'll sleep well tonight, he says. That obvious? He chuckles. Everyone sleeps well after battle rowing. The night air feels cooler now, carrying the steady whisper of waves along the shore. Out at sea, the horizon glows faintly under a rising moon. It's peaceful. But the crew hasn't entirely relaxed. Before long, one of the older sailors stands up and walks slowly toward the bow of the ship. Several others follow him, carrying a small clay bowl and a jug of wine. He glances at the veteran. What are they doing? He nods toward the group. Offering. Offering what? To the sea. You watch as the sailors pour a small amount of wine onto the sand near the ship's prow. One man murmurs a short prayer before tossing a handful of barley grains into the water. Ancient sailors were famously superstitious. The sea was unpredictable, powerful, and often deadly, so crews developed rituals to keep the gods satisfied. One of the most important figures in those beliefs was Poseidon, ruler of storms, earthquakes, and ocean waves. If sailors angered him, well, things could get unpleasant very quickly. So offerings like this were common before voyages, after battles, or whenever the crew felt the sea might need calming. Historians still argue how seriously every sailor believed in these rituals. Some probably treated them as genuine religious acts, while others may have followed along simply because tradition demanded it. Either way, no one on the beach tonight seems interested in taking chances. The offering ends with a quiet splash as the last drops of wine are poured into the water. The sailors return to the fire. "Good omen," the veteran mutters. You raise an eyebrow. Does it actually work? He shrugs. Hard to say, but nobody wants to find out what happens if we skip it. That logic is difficult to argue with. Another rower nearby joins the conversation. "Last year," he says, "a ship skipped the offering before sailing." The veteran groans. "Don't start." "What happened?" you ask. The rower leans closer to the fire. "Storm hit 2 days later. Snapped the mast clean in half." You suspect the storm probably would have arrived whether or not someone poured wine into the sea. But you wisely keep that thought to yourself. Out here, a little superstition seems perfectly reasonable. Another quirky tidbit from ancient maritime life. Some crews believed certain animals were lucky aboard ships. Dolphins, for example, were often seen as good omens if they appeared near a vessel. Other creatures had the opposite reputation. Seabirds landing on a ship could sometimes be interpreted as warnings of bad weather. Historians have uncovered dozens of strange sailor traditions like this, many passed down through generations of crews. When your survival depends on unpredictable winds and waves, small rituals become comforting. The fire burns lower as the night grows deeper. Rowers begin settling down to sleep on the sand. Cloaks are pulled tight against the cool air and the quiet murmur of conversation slowly fades. You lie back on the beach, staring up at the sky. Without city lights, the stars look unbelievably bright. The veteran lies beside you with his hands behind his head. "Tomorrow we launch at sunrise," he says lazily. You groan. "Already?" He nods. "Ships don't move themselves." You glance toward the long trireme resting above the tide line. He's right about that. Every mile across the Mediterranean requires hundreds of men pulling oars in perfect rhythm. Which raises another interesting question, one that historians still discuss today. Who exactly were those rowers? Movies often show chained slaves powering ancient warships, but the truth is a little more complicated. Some rowers were citizens, some were hired sailors, some may have been prisoners or criminals working off punishment. Navies needed enormous numbers of rowers, and different societies solved that problem in different ways. Tomorrow, as the ship launches again, you'll start learning more about the men sitting beside you on those benches. For now, though, the fire has burned down to glowing embers. The waves whisper softly along the shore, and after one exhausting day aboard an ancient warship, sleep finally begins to claim you. The first thing you notice is the cold. Not the sharp bite of winter cold, more like the damp chill of early morning creeping through your cloak as the night slowly fades. The beach is quiet except for the gentle hiss of waves sliding across the sand. For a moment you forget where you are. Then your shoulders remind you. Every muscle complains the moment you try to sit up. Your back feels stiff, your arms heavy, and your hands still sting from yesterday's blisters. Welcome to day 2 of being a warship rower. Around you, other men are beginning to stir as well. Some stretch slowly, others rub sleep from their eyes while staring out at the grey horizon. The veteran beside you yawns and rolls onto his side. "Sun's coming," he mutters. Sure enough, a faint orange glow is beginning to creep across the eastern sky. Soon the sun will rise over the calm waters of the Mediterranean, and the peaceful beach will transform back into a busy naval camp. Already sailors are moving around the ship, checking ropes and equipment. You glance toward the long trireme resting on the sand. In the soft morning light it looks almost elegant, sleek and narrow, with the bronze ram at its bow catching the first hints of sunlight. Hard to believe that same graceful vessel spent yesterday smashing into another ship at full speed. A sailor walks past carrying a small basket of bread. "Breakfast," he announces. The word spreads quickly. Rowers gather around the small campfire where a pot of barley porridge is warming again. It's the same simple meal from yesterday, but hunger makes it perfectly acceptable. You sit cross-legged in the sand, chewing slowly while the veteran joins you. "Better than rowing on an empty stomach," he says. You nod. The crew eats quickly. There's no long leisurely breakfast here. Warships move early, especially when the sea is calm. Ancient fleets preferred launching shortly after sunrise. Winds were usually lighter, and cooler temperatures made rowing slightly less miserable. As you finish the last bite of bread, the veteran nudges you. Look. Down the beach, a small group of sailors is gathering near the waterline. Two men are arguing loudly. Curious rowers begin drifting closer to watch. You follow them. One of the arguing men is a broad-shouldered sailor with a thick beard. The other is a younger rower pointing angrily toward the ship. "What's the problem?" someone asks. The bearded sailor snorts. He says rowers should get a bigger share of the loot. A few nearby sailors laugh. The younger man folds his arms stubbornly. "We power the ship," he insists. "Without us, the fleet goes nowhere." That statement earns a few nods from the rowers standing nearby. Interestingly enough, he isn't entirely wrong. Ancient naval warfare relied heavily on rowing crews. Ships couldn't maneuver, chase enemies, or escape danger without them. Because of this, rowers sometimes held a surprisingly important position in naval societies. For example, the powerful fleet of Athens depended so heavily on rowers that many of them were actually free citizens rather than slaves. Their labour gave them political influence. Historians often point out that Athenian democracy itself may have been strengthened by the importance of naval crews, which means the man complaining about payment might actually be part of a very old tradition. Rowers arguing about fairness. The bearded sailor shakes his head. "Rowers get paid," he says firmly, "that's the deal. But soldiers get the spoils. Soldiers do the fighting." From the back of the crowd, someone mutters, "Rowers do the sweating." A few men chuckle. The argument might have continued all morning, but the overseer suddenly appears behind the group. "Enough." Everyone immediately quiets. He gestures toward the ship. "Launch in 5 minutes." The crowd disperses quickly. The veteran pats your shoulder. "See? Democracy at work." You're not sure that's exactly what just happened, but the conversation does reveal something interesting. The men sitting on those benches aren't all the same. Some are experienced sailors. Some are citizens serving naval duty. Others might be hired labourers hoping for steady pay. And yes, in some places or times, slaves were also used. Navies needed enormous manpower, and societies found many different ways to fill the rowing benches. The overseer claps his hands again. "Push!" Rowers and sailors gather along the hull. Wooden rollers are placed beneath the ship while ropes stretch tight across the sand. Everyone leans forward together. The trireme slowly slides toward the water. Sand crunches beneath your feet as the hull moves inch by inch down the beach. Soon the waves reach the keel again. Hold! The ship floats lightly in the shallow surf. Sailors climb aboard, rowers follow, and just like that your brief time on solid ground comes to an end. You climb back down into the familiar wooden belly of the ship. The bench waits patiently. The oar rests beside it, and somewhere at the front of the vessel, the drummer raises his sticks. The drum beat returns. Boom, pull, boom, pull again. The ship glides away from the quiet beach, leaving behind the small campfire ashes and footprints in the sand. Within minutes, the shoreline begins shrinking behind you, fading into the soft morning haze of the Mediterranean. Another day has begun, and just like yesterday, the rhythm of rowing quickly takes over everything. Your muscles protest at first. After a night of rest, they seem slightly offended to be working again so soon. But gradually the familiar motion returns. Lean forward, push with the legs, pull the oar through the water. Pull, breathe, pull again. Rowers around you settle into the same rhythm. The long trireme cuts smoothly through the calm morning sea, oars flashing in the sunlight as the crew works in near-perfect synchronization. After yesterday's battle and stormy waves, the water now feels almost peaceful. The veteran beside you nods toward the oar ports. Good rowing weather. You glance outside. The surface of the sea stretches wide and blue under the rising sun. A few seabirds circle lazily overhead, riding the warm air currents. For now, at least, the ocean seems content. But as the drumbeat continues, the veteran begins talking quietly, the way sailors often do during long stretches of routine work. "You know," he says, "ships like this used to rule the sea." You glance over. "Used to?" He nods. The world changes. That statement might seem obvious, but in the ancient world it carried real meaning. For several centuries, fleets of triremes dominated naval warfare across the Mediterranean. Their speed and maneuverability allowed powerful states to control trade routes, defend coastlines, and launch military campaigns far from home. Famous naval clashes, such as the great battles fought during the rise of ancient Greece, relied heavily on these fast oar-driven vessels. But technology never stays the same forever. Historians often debate exactly when the golden age of the Trireme began fading. Over time, larger warships started appearing. Vessels with more rows of oars and heavier hulls. These ships were slower but stronger, capable of carrying larger crews and more soldiers. The veteran gestures vaguely with his chin toward the sea ahead. "Bigger ships coming now," he says. "Bigger how?" "4 rows of oars, sometimes 5. You blink. 5? He grins. "Imagine rowing on one of those." You try to picture it. More rowers, more benches, more endless pulling. The thought is not encouraging. The drumbeat continues steadily as the ship moves farther from shore. Pull, pull again. Another interesting historical detail emerges here. Some of these later warships, called quadriremes and quinquiremes, became common in large empires such as ancient Rome. These vessels were designed less for speed and more for carrying heavy soldiers and siege equipment during naval battles. In other words, naval warfare gradually shifted toward floating battle platforms rather than sleek ramming machines. Historians still argue about how effective these different ship designs really were. Some scholars believe triremes remained superior for manoeuvring, while others suggest the larger ships dominated through sheer strength. But one thing remained the same. All of them required rowers. Lots of rowers. The veteran stretches his neck slightly. "Ships get bigger," he says, "but the benches never get softer." You chuckle weakly. That seems like a safe historical prediction. A few hours pass as the ship continues across open water. The sun climbs higher, warming the wooden beams and turning the rowing deck into a familiar furnace of sweat and effort. Your body has adapted somewhat now. The blisters on your hands still hurt, but the rhythm feels less foreign. You move with the rest of the crew almost automatically. The drumbeat slows briefly as the helmsman adjusts course. Then it resumes. Pull, breathe, pull again. Somewhere above deck, a lookout calls out another distant sail on the horizon. But this time there is no alarm, no frantic drumbeat, just quiet observation. The ship continues forward peacefully. After yesterday's battle, the sea seems content to give everyone a break. Eventually, the veteran glances over at you with a tired smile. You're getting the hang of it. Of rowing. Of surviving. That may be the most accurate description of life on a warship you've heard yet, because survival, not glory, is what most rowers are really chasing. The ship sails on, the oars dip and rise, and somewhere ahead, another harbour, another beach, or another battle may be waiting. But the age of these great rowing fleets will not last forever. History is already moving forward, and one day, long after this voyage ends, the benches of ships like this will finally fall silent. The drumbeat slows, not suddenly, not dramatically, just a gradual easing of rhythm, like a heartbeat settling after a long run. The oars dip into the water a little less urgently now, and the ship glides forward on momentum more than effort. You notice it first in your shoulders. The tension begins to fade. Rowers glance quietly at one another, sensing the same thing. Something about the pace has changed. The veteran beside you lifts his head slightly and listens to the rhythm. "Harbour ahead," he murmurs. Sure enough, the lookout above deck soon confirms it with a distant shout. The ship begins turning gently toward the coastline that has slowly grown larger on the horizon throughout the afternoon. Another safe landing, another stretch of solid ground, and for the exhausted rowers below deck, that might be the greatest victory of all. The drumbeat slows again. Pull, glide, pull, glide. The sea around the ship becomes calmer as you approach the natural protection of the harbour. Hills rise on either side of the bay, their rocky slopes dotted with scrubby trees and pale stone. From this distance, the shoreline looks peaceful, almost inviting, quite different from the chaos of battle you witnessed yesterday. As the ship moves closer, sailors above begin preparing the ropes and anchors. The helmsman calls out short commands, guiding the long trireme carefully between shallow waters and hidden rocks. Ancient harbours could be tricky places to navigate. Unlike modern ports with large docks and cranes, many ancient ships simply beach themselves directly onto shore. Crews would then pull the vessels onto land using ropes and rollers, just like the launch you experienced earlier. It was simple, but it worked. You feel the ship slowing further. The drumbeat stops entirely. For the first time in hours, the oars rest quietly in the water. The sudden silence feels almost strange. Your hands remain gripping the wooden shaft of the oar for a moment longer, before the overseer's voice echoes down the rowing deck. "Hold!" Rowers freeze. Then comes the final command. "Lift!" The oars rise together from the water in a single coordinated motion. You pull yours inside the hull, resting it carefully along the side, and just like that, the day's rowing is finished. Above, sailors toss ropes into the shallow surf while others leap into the water to guide the ship the last few meters toward the beach. Soon the hull gently scrapes the sand. A familiar sound now. Rowers climb out one by one, legs stiff after hours on the benches. When your feet finally touch the ground again, the sensation feels oddly luxurious, even though the beach is nothing more than coarse sand and scattered pebbles. The veteran stretches his arms wide. "Another day," he says. You nod. Another day survived. And that simple phrase may capture the reality of ancient naval life better than any heroic legend. Because for most rowers, life aboard these ships wasn't about glory or epic victory. It was about endurance, about sore muscles, blistered hands, cramped benches, and endless miles of ocean. Historians sometimes emphasize the brilliant naval tactics and famous commanders of ancient fleets, and those stories certainly deserve their place in history. But beneath those stories were thousands of ordinary men, anonymous rowers whose strength powered every maneuver, every chase, every battle. Without them, none of it would have happened. Some rowers may have been citizens proud to serve their city-state. Others might have been hired labourers hoping for steady pay. Still others could have been prisoners, slaves, or unlucky sailors caught by circumstance. Historians still argue about the exact makeup of many rowing crews, because records from the ancient world are often incomplete. But one thing is clear. The Mediterranean's powerful warships could never move without the steady rhythm of human muscle. The veteran begins walking slowly up the beach toward a small fire being prepared by the sailors. You follow. Behind you, the long trireme rests quietly on the sand, its oars pulled in, its hull drying in the late afternoon sun. For the first time since you boarded it, the ship feels almost peaceful. As the sky begins turning orange, the sea reflects soft golden light across the bay. The crew settles into another evening of simple food and quiet conversation. And somewhere out on the open water, waves continue rolling endlessly toward distant shores. But for now, your journey as a warship rower has come to an end. The fire burns low beside the quiet harbour. You sit on the warm sand, listening to the gentle rhythm of the waves as they slide across the shore and retreat again into the darkening sea. The long day slowly melts away. Muscles that once strained against heavy oars now relax in the calm evening air. The steady drumbeat that guided every stroke has faded into memory, replaced by the soft crackle of the fire and the distant cry of seabirds settling for the night. Out on the water, the surface of the Mediterranean glows faintly beneath the first rising stars. Your warship rests silently nearby, pulled safely onto the sand, its sleek shape now nothing more than a dark outline against the twilight. No drums, no shouting, no splashing oars, just quiet. You breathe slowly, feeling the gentle coolness of the evening breeze drift across the beach. Somewhere beside you, sailors murmur softly as they prepare to sleep. The long voyage, the hard rowing, the endless rhythm of the sea, all of it begins to feel distant now. Tomorrow the ship may launch again. Another crew might take the benches. Another journey may begin. But tonight the sea is calm. The sky is wide and peaceful, and the ancient warship rower, at least for now, can finally rest. So let your thoughts drift slowly like waves across the water. Let the rhythm of the sea grow softer, and allow the quiet of the ancient harbour to gently carry you towards sleep.